Folks, if you're just waking up this morning, Alan Greenspan has died. Obviously, he steered monetary policy in the United States for 5 terms as Federal Reserve Chairman. He is survived by his wife of 29 years, NBC News correspondent Andrea Mitchell. In a statement, she said, Alan passed away at our home this morning at the age of 100 from complications of Parkinson's disease. She went on to just say that he was a giant of a man who helped shape the U.S. economy for decades under presidents of both parties, but was always honest in acknowledging his mistakes, and talked about his irrational exuberance for baseball, the Washington Commanders, tennis, golf, and music, and especially jazz. Steve Liesman joins us right now on the Squawk Newsline, and no exaggeration to say that he was a giant of our world, Steve.
Yeah, and I think a person whose economic policies and monetary policies are something we're still living with in many, many ways. And I'm thinking back now on the things that he introduced. And one of the great ironies, I think, Becky, maybe worth talking about is, well, he was famous for his Fed speak and not being understood. The interesting thing about that is he's also one of the people who introduced more transparency into the Federal Reserve. People forget perhaps that he's the one who started the statement, and they were very clear and concise statements. And while we think about the issues that Kevin Warsh is dealing with as Fed chair, not issuing forward guidance, Alan Greenspan kind of started a forward guidance. He had a thing called the balance of risks, and if the balance of risks were tilted towards inflation, well, you could say the Fed was probably going to be hiking interest rates or keeping rates high. And if it was tilted towards concern about unemployment, well, it would go in the other way. So it's a bit of a contradiction, but he was very famous for being obfuscating in his talking, but also introduced and started the Fed on this trajectory towards transparency that we're still thinking about and dealing with. And I'm like to tell you a small anecdote, which is when I finally got up the nerve to go up and approach Alan Greenspan at Jackson Hole to talk to him when I was a young reporter. His first word to me was productivity.
Productivity being the secret to everything that could drive, allow them to keep lower interest rates while there was some really impressive things happening. Productivity was the key to everything for growth.
Yeah,
in the nation.
and I remember how he said it was productivity, almost like a Southern guy, but he said it very clearly and concisely. And you're right, Becky, because and it's a very interesting story, because to me, one of the things he's most famous with, obviously, he was part of the Committee to Save the World, part of the Social Security fix in 1983. But the most interesting thing he did was in 1995, 96, when inflation was a bit high, and the whole computer revolution and internet revolution was beginning. And his colleagues, including famous people like Janet Yellen, Larry Meyer, and even Roger Ferguson, were thinking it's time to raise rates. Alan looked around and did what he did probably best, which is look at alternative data. One of the alternative data sets he looked at was the purchases of computer equipment. And Alan said, you know what? If they're buying it, there must be something to it. And the productivity was famously, again, not in the data. But Alan looked around and he said, it's there. And so he did not raise rates in 95 and 96 when economic theory, the economic establishment thought he should have. And he let it ride for a while. And he let it ride to about 1999. And that's also a little instructive part, which is eventually, because of what was happening in the economy, in part because of the investment boom. And again, there's an analogy to what we're talking about now. We're living through it now. He did have to raise rates eventually. But the idea of holding the line for 4 years and letting, I guess he tweaked it once in the middle. Go ahead, Beth, sorry.
Well, you know, that's the same idea that the current FOMC chairman, the new FOMC chairman, Kevin Warsh, kind of has, too, that this idea that if AI makes us much more productive, maybe he can be in that same position of not raising rates right away, despite what may be happening in the economy. That's been something he's talked about for quite a while, looking back at Alan Greenspan as his reason for talking through that.
Precisely. Kevin Warsh is very animated, or his policies are animated by the promise of AI. But it becomes an interesting discussion, Becky, because the thing to remember about Alan is he did not raise rates, but he didn't cut them either. And Kevin was talking before he took office a little bit more in terms of the ability to cut rates because of AI rather than just keep them where they are right now. And what's interesting is, at least initially, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say he was under pressure too. I remember that the first George Bush blamed him for not cutting rates. But something I was thinking about while you were talking, Steve, he was, unlike some of the people that came after him, he was really accessible to us. I mean, he knew about the briefcase indicator, and he talked about it and thought it was pretty funny. He used to come on, and we had interviews with him when he was... Yeah, and you might recall, Steve, that we changed the ticker for Alan Greenspan because he said, you know, you always have the stocks on. He wanted the 10-year... Yeah. He wanted us to put up the 10-year note permanently.
Because
that's what he wanted to watch. Yeah, because that's what he wanted to watch.
More than the Dow or the S&P or anything else.
Yeah, but we don't get that. And even though he obfuscated a lot, he was very open and accessible. I guess he was a fan of the show or something because he knew everything that we were doing, and I think he got a kick out of the briefcase indicator.
Yeah, Joe, I'm trying to remember if Alan was accessible to us while he was in office or after he was in office.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
I think it was after.
I think it was after.
I think, but you were on Squawk longer, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think he, I don't, you know what? Everything gets muddled. But as I said, I actually, I don't know how it happened, but my wife and I went with him and Andrea to Cafe Milano and had dinner and had a great evening. And I don't know. He was a really great man and a you know, Steve, as far as Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and all that kind of stuff, I think he had a great affinity for that, I guess, those economic viewpoints. I don't know if you found that, too, when you were with him.
Oh, most certainly. He was a great and gracious man, and he was accessible to people off camera, was my recollection. If you had a question, Alan would spend time to talk you through it. He had a particular way of letting his policies be known. There was a Washington Post reporter who was the general conduit for it, and that was kind of like the transformation that Bernanke eventually made. He kind of made it made the circle a little bit wider of people who he talked to and made himself more accessible. But I see Alan on part of that step, and Alan also had a political bent. He knew he wanted to have certain people on his side, and that's always something that's been needed. Jay Powell also understood that a little bit more with Congress, and Alan had his had his supporters. It was a big thing. I'm trying to remember. It was a Congressman Gonzalez that I think he found out that there were minutes and got very angry about the fact that the minutes weren't public, and it was because of the argument in Congress. I hope somebody's going to correct me online about this, but I think I have this right. Because of that argument and Congressman Gonzalez, that the minutes eventually became public. So that and Alan kind of bent that way. I guess we could talk a little bit about the mistakes he made. He's criticized. I'm not sure this is right. I don't know where I stand on this, for having supported the tax cuts of George Bush, I believe in early 2001, because he was afraid that the government would garner too big of a surplus. And then, of course, the mistake that he acknowledged later on in his career. And Joe, this is something you and I can talk about, and with Becky and everybody and Rick forever. Alan thought markets would take care of themselves in the 2005, 2006 era. And he did not understand why they did not self-correct and self-police themselves. And, of course, the whole derivative world went crazy, and we had the great financial crisis. And Alan eventually acknowledged that mistake. And I get, and Joe, you brought up the Ayn Rand idea and the kind of libertarian philosophy that he lived by. And I want to point out, because something I said earlier was we're still living with Alan's theory of addressing the irrational exuberance, so to speak, after the fact, and not using policy to stop bubbles while they happen, but being prepared to address them afterwards. And I'll come back to that in just a second. That's still a doctrine that we're living with right now. And it's important to recognize that, because I don't think Powell, I don't think Bernanke, I don't think Yellen, I don't think Kevin has a better idea of the Fed intervening, other than these very soft, jawboning type interventions they do when they feel like there's certain things. But the idea being that is something we're still living with, this idea of addressing it afterwards and not before.
Yeah, it had to be. So 2006, I think he stepped down, and then he wrote a book and did book tour. But he was, I think he might have even guest hosted. He was on a lot after that, and we'd go down and see him, and he'd come on for an hour at a time. So yeah, it was after, I guess.
I'm going to use that as a quick lesson, which is I think what he did afterwards was continue to use his intelligence.
He did.
His authority and his power to play a role in public life. I could see Ben Bernanke, Jay Powell, and Janet Yellen also doing that as well. I mean, I think they want to make room for the new chair, but Alan was out there and visible and writing and being a part of the public discussion after he left office. And he did a lot of great work after he left office. Yeah,
he did. I didn't realize that he only came into that job about 2 months before Black Monday in 1987, when the Dow dropped 22% in a day. He responded to that very quickly by trying to make sure there was a lot of liquidity in the markets, and that's kind of where the Greenspan put came from. But it's a good thing there was somebody there who understood the need for liquidity when that happened.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to remind. If you could look it up there, I can't remember what the famous phrase was, but something like, the Fed will provide all the liquidity the market needs. That was the, and by the way, that went back to the old Bagehot 19th century central banking doctrine. And he just made that one sentence, and it really was the foundation of stabilizing the market after that. And that's been an idea that's been used ever since. Bernanke in the great financial crisis, Powell in the pandemic, both used that same concept to provide the liquidity the market needs in the time of crisis. Now, both of them took it a little further. The Fed will provide all the
liquidity needed, I guess is the phrase.
Not quite a Hank Paulson bazooka in my pocket, but
same thing.
But the same thing, yeah.
But you know what? So Alan understood the power of the Fed. He used it carefully. He used it prudently. And when it was needed, he used it to great effect.
He played clarinet, I think, right? I think that was his thing.
I remember he told me he would have been a professional jazz player, but he looked around the world and decided that the world did not need him as a professional jazz player.
Yeah. Can't remember.
I think it was trumpet. Am I wrong about that? Maybe it was clarinet.
We got it.
What instrument?
These are things we need to know. Maybe not. Maybe I'm thinking of.
But he played the briefcase best of all, I think.
The clarinet and the saxophone. And occasionally the flute. He played the clarinet and the saxophone and occasionally the flute.
Okay, somebody sent me the direct quote here, my friend Mark Spindell. The Federal Reserve, consistent with the responsibilities as the nation's central bank, affirmed today its readiness to serve as a source of liquidity to support the economic and financial system. That was the direct quote.